Alright, so this video is going to go through the two major monotheistic religions that we are learning about during periods 1 and 2 of world history as we are looking at how these emerge and impact the world. Obviously, these two will also impact later on Islam, and we will learn about that later in the course, but it is crucial that you understand these two, especially if you're living in the western part of the world, as these are major religions that you probably encounter or maybe even have a background in yourself. So we're going to start with Judaism as it came first, and then we're going to move on to Christianity. Both are monotheistic religions, which means they believe in one God. So as we start here, one of the first things I want you to pay attention to is just to try to think to yourself, or if you're in a group, you could push pause on this video, talk to some of the people around you, even if you're by yourself, just to think and jot down some of the things. What are the key beliefs of Judaism? Maybe something that you learned. Maybe it's something that you know from your own experiences. But take a second to pause the video and just write down a few things and see what you can come up with. Key people, key beliefs, etc. Now, this used to be known as Hebrew monotheism, but then will become and will be known as Judaism as time goes on, and the Jewish people. So take that, and then we're going to look at some of the answers in just a second. Now, hopefully these are some of the things that maybe you came up with, and we're going to kind of go through these and be good things for you to write down if you don't know them. Now, Judaism, or Hebrew monotheism, started with the Hebrew people. They were a people that were in Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers of the Tigris and the Euphrates, and eventually they are going to migrate from the area of Mesopotamia over to Palestine, which is closer to the Mediterranean Sea. Now, they believed in one God, as they were monotheistic, and they called this God Yahweh. It is a God who cared about them, who was all about justice, and really created this covenant with them. A covenant is like a promise or a special relationship or a contract that people enter into. And that's the case here. And so they have this special relationship with their God, Yahweh. And this all really began with a person named Abraham. And so maybe you remember this from the last time we maybe talked about it, but Abraham created this special relationship that Yahweh had with him, and they talked, and God or Yahweh promised them a few different things. And the two major things are in this next bullet point. One, they said that there is a land that we have for you. Remember, the Hebrew people have been moved around a lot by different political states during this time. They never really had a homeland, and Yahweh promised them a land that would be theirs, that would be their homeland. And second, that their descendants would be as numerous as the stars, as their holy scriptures, or the Tanakh, or the Hebrew Bible talks about. And so these are the two things that kind of are their main beliefs. They believe in the covenant that Yahweh or God had with Abraham, that there is land for them, and that they're going to have descendants that will be as numerous as the stars. However, things kind of go awry, and because of the different political states, they become enslaved by the Egyptians as they're moving around, trying to eventually have a land of their own. We see some of the history talks about a man named Moses. Moses is a person who then works to help free them from the Egyptians and then leads them ideally to the promised land. And there's a lot of history that goes into this, and maybe if you come from a background where you've heard of these things, you might know some of these stories. But the history then shows different things. That eventually, this group of people, the Hebrew people, will create a small state. And eventually it will break into two different nations. The northern kingdom will be known as Israel, and the southern kingdom will be known as Judah. And that's kind of where we're going to pick up around 1000 BCE. So we are a long time before the other things that we're going to learn about. A few key beliefs about these people. Their scriptures are written down, and it's called the Tanakh, or the Hebrew Bible. Tanakh is kind of like an acronym in some ways. It stands for the Torah, which are the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, or the writings of Moses, or the books of Moses. And then it's going to have a section about the prophets' writings, and then it's going to have other writings. And so we see that the Tanakh, or the Hebrew Bible, has these different parts. Now, many people will call this the Old Testament, but that's coming from a Christian point of view. It is different and yet the same, as in, we'll talk about Christianity soon, that they take the Hebrew Bible and then almost as if they add on or take it as part of their story. If you're Jewish, though, you only have the Hebrew Bible or the Tanakh. You don't call it the Old Testament because it's the only testament to them. And so that's important to kind of differentiate here depending on how you're talking about this subject. And they also believe a Messiah will come. They do not believe that Jesus is that Messiah that will set them free from kind of this lifetime, as you can kind of see here, of being moved around and conquered, and someone will come. And a lot of times people see this Messiah as like a political ruler of some sort. And so in understanding the context of that they've lived through, that kind of makes sense as you look at the Hebrew people. So those are some of the major beliefs about Judaism, depending on what you got when you kind of brainstormed there. Now, a few other things to take note. When we're looking at this land, and we are looking at Israel and Judah, we see this area of Judea, and we're going to look at this within the context, especially what you're learning now, within the Roman Empire. So the Roman Empire is going to span around the Mediterranean, and this area that we're talking about, these Hebrew people, are going to be coming out of this western area of the Middle East along the Mediterranean, where we're going to eventually see in modern day context after 1947-48 the creation of the nation of that we know today of Israel. But that was not like a state as we know it back then. And so here is kind of what the map looks like as we are going through this. Now, another key thing that you need to understand about Judaism is the importance of the temple, or the Jewish temple. Now, when you hear the Jewish temple, this is really like the center of Jewish worship. Now, it is going to be built, as you see on the screen here, by King Solomon in 967 BCE, so before Common Era. And so Solomon is going to be this king. He's going to reign for a period of time. He's going to be known as a wise ruler. He's going to build the first temple, and he has a vast amount of wealth. And so he builds this temple. Now, the temple is going to be the structure, like we said, that is the center of worship. And it's supposed to be kind of like three key areas. It's kind of where sacrifices and rituals were completed by the Jewish people. And so there's some sort of like giving. And when you think of like giving, today when we think of like offerings or giving or tithing, we think of like giving money. At this time period, they gave and they had sacrifices or rituals that they did, which were a lot of times, whether they were animal sacrifices, burnt offerings, peace offerings, sin offerings, that could have been like food or animals or drink, etc., that they would offer here, which kind of served a few things. One, it would serve as kind of a substitute to atone for their sins. And one, it was the whole goal was to draw closer to Yahweh. And so as you look here, Solomon built this temple, and it's going to stay standing as we kind of look on here, all the way until the Romans. It's going to be destroyed by the Babylonians. We've heard of the Babylonians before, remember, like King Hammurabi. But also we're going to see that it's going to stand this after it's rebuilt, and it's going to be destroyed all the way in 70 CE, Common Era. So we're past the zero here, and it's going to be destroyed by the Romans. And so the temple stands, and today there is no Jewish temple. There's only a part of the wall that remains in Jerusalem where this was originally built, and that is part of the Wailing Wall. But as you guys can see here, like this was a center. Now people who are Jewish just worship in a synagogue, and they don't do these sacrifices after the temple was destroyed, because there is no right place, according to their scriptures, for these sacrifices to be made, because it has to be done in a temple. Since there's no temple, they don't do these sacrifices anymore if you're Jewish. And if you kind of are looking around the temple here, if we look at this picture, I believe this will zoom in over to the left. There's the temple. We have this area to the left here that's called the Holy of Holies, or the Most Holy Place. And in there we have the Ark of the Covenant, if you're familiar with Indiana Jones. Only the high priest can enter this area, but that's where that is housed. And that was all within the temple. And then as we kind of go over to other areas, there's a place where these offerings and sacrifices are made. And as we said before, not only is this to give, not only as a substitute for sins and to draw closer to God, but atonement, if we look at the definition of the word atonement, which I would make sure that you write down, is basically a satisfaction or reparation for a wrong. Like it makes the people right. And some of the sacrifices that Jewish people did were to make individuals right with Yahweh, and sometimes it would be like a community thing. Because of this covenant, because of this special relationship they had with Yahweh, this covenant made a special relationship with them and God, and so this is a key part of their belief system. Yom Kippur, if you've heard of that holiday, means the Day of Atonement within the Jewish faith. And so here is kind of the key beliefs as we look at Judaism and the beliefs that they have there. We know today, because there is no temple, they don't do these sacrifices anymore, and they now worship in synagogues where it's more about prayer. And depending on what type of Jew you would be, if you're an Orthodox Jew, you're still waiting for a Messiah, and you still believe that their temple should be rebuilt. And then other Jewish people today would consider that they are past the time of the temple, and they believe in just some of the same actions of social justice and other things, but that the temple is unnecessary and that they just devote their lives to prayer and action, going to the synagogue, which is their place of worship. And so these are the kind of key beliefs of Judaism, things that you need to know about Judaism. And then we're going to continue on and talk about how do these ideas link with those of Christianity. As you look here, this is Jerusalem, and we see that this wall that you see in the background here that people go to is part of the Wailing Wall or the Western Wall, which is the only remaining wall that's part of the temple from back in the times when Solomon built the temple. It was rebuilt after it was destroyed, but then stood till the time of the Romans when it was destroyed and never rebuilt. And so people still come here as a sacred place of prayer, hoping for the day, for many of them, especially Orthodox Jews, of the rebuilding of the temple so they could regain these things. But again, we know that this has been almost 2,000 years since this has happened. So we'll look now to see how these ideas link with Christianity.